Nobody knows him better than I do. It is extremely painful to see him, what he's going through now, see him struggling. I honestly cannot put in words how hurt the family was.
Almost every single day, something unexpected kept happening at a hospital in Pretoria. Winnie Madikizela Mandela, long divorced from Nelson Mandela, still showed up like clockwork. And that alone raises a question that refuses to go away. What kind of bond survives a divorce, scandals, and decades of pressure?
I sat there for 3.5 hours watching that machine. But the first shock I got as I got in was the fact that they had switched off the dialysis machine.
At 76, Winnie was not just revisiting the past. She was carrying stories the world had only guessed at. Their love story looked like hope from the outside. But behind closed doors, things were never that simple. And when Winnie finally spoke, the truth did not just surprise people. It changed everything. The revelations Winnie finally shared at 79. There is something deeply complicated about looking back at the relationship between Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela, especially when conversations turned to pain, prison, love, and everything that slowly fell apart behind closed doors. And one might honestly pause and wonder, how does a love story survive that kind of pressure? And more importantly, what happens when it does not? Years after the divorce, words began to come out, not in loud public speeches, but in quieter reflections shared with close associates. And it was said that Nelson admitted that Winnie went through something far worse than anything personally experienced during imprisonment, which is already difficult to imagine, because how could anything be worse than decades behind bars? Yet, that was the weight of the statement, and the tone carried something even heavier, which was guilt. Deep, personal, unshakable guilt. It was shared that Nelson openly said responsibility rested on personal shoulders, explaining that Winnie spent about 1.5 years in solitary confinement. And the reasoning given felt almost painfully simple, almost too simple, because the explanation came down to marriage itself. That raises a quiet but serious question. Does love sometimes place people in danger without meaning to? Prison records added another layer to this already heavy picture, suggesting concern about influence on family life, especially on the children, with notes describing a lack of respect for community values, family structure, and even the relationship itself. And hearing that, another question slowly comes in. How much damage can distance, fear, and pressure create inside a home before anything fully breaks? Then attention shifts to the separation, officially announced in 1992. But the truth behind that decision did not begin there. And that part feels important, because announcements often come after long periods of silence and tension, not at the beginning of problems. And Nelson's own court testimony revealed how deep the cracks had already become. It was explained that the most private conversations between partners usually happen in the bedroom, where honesty, vulnerability, and difficult truths are supposed to be shared. Yet even that space had become strained. There was a mention that Winnie avoided confrontation, and that alone says a lot, because what happens when two people stop facing problems directly? Problems do not disappear, problems grow quietly, and over time, silence can become louder than arguments. Nelson described a deep loneliness during the marriage, which stands out in a powerful way. Because how does someone feel alone while still in a relationship? That question does not have an easy answer, but it clearly shows that emotional distance had already taken hold. Then came another turning point, when a newspaper editor presented a letter that suggested a possible relationship between Winnie and Dali Mpofu, and that moment seemed to confirm suspicions that had already been building. At the same time, There were reports about financial issues connected to a position in social welfare. And when personal struggles begin to mix with public controversy, things tend to become even more difficult to manage. So, the decision to separate did not come from one single moment, but from a series of events that slowly pushed everything to a breaking point. And again, a quiet question appears. How many relationships end not because of one big mistake, but because of many small cracks that were never fully repaired? Winnie's own reflections, however, added a completely different tone to the story, one that carried both sadness and a kind of quiet acceptance. And there was an acknowledgement that very little time was spent truly loving Nelson, which sounds simple at first, but feels deeply emotional when considered carefully. Because what does it mean to love someone and still not have enough time to actually experience that love? That idea alone can sit with someone for a long time. It was also shared that the love never really disappeared, even after years of separation. And that brings another thought to mind. Can love exist even when a relationship no longer does? That kind of emotional contradiction is not easy to explain, but it feels very real in situations like this. Then the conversation moves into one of the most difficult and controversial chapters, involving the Mandela United Football Club and the events that led to the appearance before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in December 1997. And this part of the story carries a completely different weight, because now the focus shifts from personal relationships to public accountability. For hours, questions were asked, and answers did not come easily. There was resistance, deflection, and a sense that full acknowledgement was being avoided. And then came a moment that many people still remember, when Desmond Tutu made an emotional appeal, not as an official, but as someone speaking from a place of deep concern and humanity. The plea was repeated, asking for an honest acknowledgement, suggesting that greatness would become even greater with a simple admission that things went wrong. And hearing that, one might wonder, why is saying sorry sometimes the hardest thing to do, even when everything points toward it? Eventually, there was a shift. A statement came that acknowledged that things had indeed gone terribly wrong, and there was an expression of deep regret for the painful years that caused harm, including an apology to the families of Stompie Saipi and Abu Bakr Asvat, both of whom lost their lives in 1989. That moment carried emotional weight, because acknowledgement can open the door to healing, at least in some way. But even within that apology, there remained a firm stance on innocence, with claims that witnesses were not telling the truth. And that creates a complicated situation, because how can someone express regret while still denying responsibility? That question does not have a simple answer. And perhaps that is why this entire story continues to feel layered, emotional, and difficult to fully understand. Looking at everything together, the relationship, the prison years, the separation, the public controversies, and the moments of reflection, there is a sense that this was never a simple story about love or politics alone, but something much more complex, shaped by history, pressure, choices, and human emotion. And maybe the biggest question that quietly lingers beneath it all is this: when love exists side by side with struggle, sacrifice, and pain, how much can it truly endure before something finally gives way? The answer isn't simple, and what comes next reveals a legacy far more complicated than it first appears. So stay with this till the very end. The young social worker who caught Mandela's eye. Winnie Madikizela Mandela, born as Nomzamo Winifred Madikizela in the rural lands of Transkei. And even that name carried a quiet weight, because the meaning pointed to someone destined to go through trials. And really, How often does a name seem to predict a life so clearly? After finishing a social work degree in 1955 and standing at the very top of the class, a move to Johannesburg followed, filled with ambition, purpose, and, perhaps, a quiet hope for something more. Life seemed to move in a steady, almost ordinary direction until one simple moment changed everything. A bus stop in Soweto in 1957 became the setting of a turning point. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just a young woman waiting like anyone else. But then a passing car slowed attention, and inside sat Nelson Mandela, already a known lawyer, already a man with presence, already a man with responsibilities that could not be ignored. And then a question almost asks itself, how does something so life-changing begin from something so simple? Interest sparked immediately, and that interest did not stay quiet. Mandela became deeply drawn from that very first moment, and rather than letting that feeling fade, effort followed. A search for a phone number began, and once that number was found, a call was made and a lunch date was arranged for the following week. It sounded almost straightforward, but nothing about the situation truly felt simple. Mandela stood at 38 years old, already married to Evelyn Mays, already a father of 3, and already deeply involved in a growing political struggle that demanded time, energy, and sacrifice. That alone raises a quiet thought. Does love ever arrive at a convenient time? Or does love often walk in right when life already feels full? The first meeting led to more contact, and almost immediately, a pattern started to take shape. Winnie later described how a call came the very next day, with an arrangement to be picked up after work. And here is where things begin to feel a little unusual. Instead of a quiet dinner or a calm outing, Mandela arrived dressed for exercise and took her along to watch a workout session. And that detail alone makes one pause for a second. What kind of relationship begins with gym routines instead of long conversations over meals? Yet that unusual rhythm quickly became normal. Time together often meant watching from the side while Mandela trained, followed by quick movements to meetings, and then a brief drop-off at the hostel before rushing away again. Winnie later explained that life with Mandela felt like a life where presence and absence existed at the same time. That thought alone carries weight. How does a connection grow when time together feels so limited? How does affection survive when attention constantly shifts toward something larger, something political, something urgent? Still, something strong held everything together, and that connection moved forward at a surprising pace. The proposal did not arrive with long speeches or carefully planned settings. Instead, Mandela pulled over on the side of the road and spoke in a direct and almost casual way, saying that a visit to a dressmaker for a wedding gown was needed. A question followed about the number of bridesmaids, and Winnie responded in the simplest way possible, asking only about the time. And that moment almost feels like a quiet confirmation that both sides already understood what was happening. No hesitation, no confusion, just movement toward a shared decision. But then again, how often does something so serious move forward so quickly without doubt creeping in? Marriage followed in 1958. Only 3 months after a divorce from Evelyn Mace became official. Even the wedding itself carried signs of the political tension surrounding Mandela's life. Permission had to be requested from the apartheid government just to allow attendance at the ceremony. And that permission came with strict limits, allowing only a short 6-day break from a banning order. Even a wedding, a moment that usually belongs to joy and celebration, became shaped by control and restriction. Does that not already say something about the kind of life that lay ahead? Soon after, children entered the picture, with Zenani born in 1959 and Zinziswa in 1960, adding another layer to an already complex life. Family, love, politics, and struggle all began to exist side by side, often pulling in different directions. And then reality settled in more deeply. Winnie later reflected that no promise of special attention ever came. Mandela did not pretend that time would be easily available for family life. The struggle always came first, and that truth remained clear from the beginning. That raises another quiet question. What does it mean to share a life with someone whose first loyalty belongs to a cause much larger than home? The relationship became something unique, something that mixed personal affection with political awakening. Winnie described how the experience of being with Mandela also meant becoming part of a broader fight, almost as if love and politics became intertwined from the very start. That kind of partnership does not follow a simple path. It demands strength, patience, and a willingness to accept constant absence. At the same time, public appearances together carried meaning beyond personal connection. A striking and confident black couple standing side by side in apartheid South Africa created a powerful image, one that spoke without words. Both individuals seemed to understand that presence alone could send a message. That brings another thought into focus. Can a relationship become more than just a private bond? Can two people together represent something larger, something symbolic, something political? In this case, the answer seemed clear. Every appearance, every moment together, carried weight in a society shaped by division and inequality. So what started at a simple bus stop grew into something layered, complex, and deeply tied to history. A glance turned into a meeting turned into a connection, and that connection moved quickly into marriage, family, and shared struggle. Yet, beneath all of that, a quiet tension remained between personal life and public duty. And maybe that is the real question sitting at the center of everything. How does love survive when time, attention, and energy constantly belong to something bigger, something that keeps pulling a partner away day after day? It sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? But the truth is far more complex. Stay right here till the very end, because this reality will change everything you thought you knew. Life as a political prisoner's wife. A quiet but heavy shift began the moment Nelson Mandela disappeared behind prison walls in the early 1960s, and life outside suddenly became something else entirely. Imagine a home where laughter once lived, now replaced by long silences and unanswered questions. How does a household continue when a father figure vanishes into a prison on an island far away? That question sat at the center of everything that followed. Winnie Mandela remained behind with two young daughters, Zenani and Zinziswa, and the weight of raising a family alone settled in without warning. Visits to Robben Island came only once every 6 months, and even those moments felt cold and distant. A wire mesh stood between husband and wife. Guards listened to every word, and not even a simple touch was allowed for more than 2 decades. What kind of connection survives under conditions like that? Conversations had to carry love, pain, and hope all at once. Yet even those conversations were controlled. Life at home refused to stay quiet for long, because the apartheid system made sure of that. Banning orders began to close in, first limiting movement to Johannesburg, then shrinking life further into just the Orlando area in Soweto. Freedom became smaller and smaller. Work as a social worker disappeared, cutting off both income and purpose. Then came the constant police raids. Picture a home where peace could be broken at any hour. Officers would arrive again and again, sometimes 4 times in a single day, shining harsh lights through windows before forcing entry. Children would wake up terrified, clinging tightly while chaos filled every corner of the house. How does any parent explain that kind of fear to a child? How does strength hold steady in moments like that? Each raid felt like a message, a reminder that control extended into every part of daily life. Then came an even darker turn. On May 12, 1969, an arrest under the Terrorism Act changed everything again. Detention lasted 491 days, and more than a year of that time passed in complete isolation. Think about silence stretching day after day with no friendly voice, no comfort, no sense of time moving forward. Interrogations brought a different kind of suffering. Bright lights stayed on without rest. Sleep became impossible, and food was withheld until the body gave in. Fainting became frequent, and physical pain mixed with mental strain in ways that are hard to fully describe. What happens to the human mind under that kind of pressure? What keeps a person from breaking completely? Reports described blood appearing due to the extreme conditions, a clear sign that the body itself struggled to endure what was happening. The cell itself told another story. A narrow space, about 15 feet by 5 feet, stood next to a room where others faced torture. Sounds of pain traveled through walls, turning every moment into a reminder of what could happen next. Inside that cell sat only 2 worn mats, a few blankets, and a simple bucket. Even basic medical care was denied. Prescriptions were withheld, leading to blackouts, body spasms, heavy bleeding, and long-term damage to the heart. Each day became a test of survival. How does anyone come out of such an experience with strength still intact? That question lingered long after release. Years later, another form of punishment arrived, this time through banishment. In May 1977, a forced move to Brandfort, a small and isolated town far from Johannesburg, created yet another challenge. The house waiting there barely qualified as a home. No running water, no electricity, no proper floors, no finished ceilings. Just an empty shell in a quiet place far removed from familiar surroundings. Rules limited contact with others, allowing only one visitor at a time. Communication with friends became rare, often depending on waiting outside a public telephone booth, hoping for a call. Imagine standing there day after day, holding on to the possibility of hearing a familiar voice. How does loneliness shape a person in a place like that? Yet something unexpected began to grow in that same space. Instead of giving in to isolation, a different path appeared. Community work started to take root. A creche opened to support children. A soup kitchen began feeding those in need. A mobile health unit provided care where little existed before. Gardens were planted, bringing both food and a sense of shared effort. Slowly, Brandfort changed, not through large resources or outside support, but through determination and steady action. Reflection later revealed that activity during those years reached a level never seen before. How does such strength appear in a place meant to break the spirit? That question reveals something deeper about resilience. At the same time, a broader political shift was unfolding. The 1976 Soweto uprising marked a turning point, especially among young people demanding change. In response, involvement in forming the Black Parents Association created a new role within a growing movement. A new identity began to take shape, no longer defined only by marriage to a well-known prisoner, but by leadership and presence within a larger struggle. Many began to see a figure who stood not just as a partner left behind, but as a powerful voice, in a difficult time. What transforms someone from a private individual into a public symbol? What pushes a person to step into that kind of responsibility? Through all these moments, a pattern becomes clear. Hardship did not arrive in a single wave, but came again and again in different forms. Family separation, state control, imprisonment, isolation, and forced relocation all combined into one long test. Yet, alongside each hardship came action, response, and a refusal to disappear quietly. Raising two daughters under such pressure alone already required strength beyond ordinary understanding. Adding constant surveillance, fear, and loss made that burden feel almost impossible to carry. Yet somehow, life kept moving, shaped by quiet decisions made in moments of deep uncertainty. But what remained hidden for decades would finally come to light. Stay with this, because the revelations Winnie finally shared at 79 change everything. The complex legacy of their marriage. A quiet but powerful explanation often followed any deep look into the relationship between Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela, because that union was never just about love or marriage, and anyone paying close attention could not help but ask a simple question. Was this ever truly a normal relationship? Or was this something far bigger? Something that carried the weight of an entire country struggling to breathe under apartheid? Conversations around this bond often revealed that the marriage stood as a symbol of two powerful but very different visions for South Africa's future. And that difference slowly shaped not just private moments, but public history itself. Behind closed doors and away from public speeches, reports suggested that Winnie believed deeply in the idea that freedom would not come gently, and that real liberation might require force, resistance, and even confrontation. That belief led to actions that leaned toward armed struggle, even at times when Nelson stood firmly on a different path. Now think about that for a second. How does a relationship survive when two people are fighting for the same goal, but completely disagree on how to reach it? That tension quietly grew over time, and it reflected a larger conflict happening across the country, where many young activists, especially after events like the Soweto uprising, began to lose patience with slow change and started demanding immediate and forceful action. During prison visits, discussions between both figures reportedly carried more weight than many public meetings, because Winnie often pushed strong ideas that connected with younger generations. Reports explained that Winnie encouraged Nelson to recognize the anger and urgency coming from youth movements and to understand the rise of Black consciousness thinking, even when older members of the African National Congress felt uncomfortable with that shift. That moment raised another quiet question. Was Winnie simply being radical? Or was Winnie reading the mood of a generation that felt ignored and pushed to the edge? Nelson, even from prison, listened carefully, and that ability to listen helped bridge a growing gap between older leadership and younger voices. That alone showed something important, because even in disagreement, there was influence. And even in conflict, there was a strange kind of balance. But still, the deeper issue never fully disappeared. Nelson feared that a full embrace of violence could open a door that might never close, possibly leading South Africa into endless cycles of revenge and civil war. Winnie, on the other hand, appeared to believe that without pressure and confrontation, real change might never arrive. That difference created a silent battle of ideas, one rooted in hope for peace, and the other in urgency for justice. As time moved forward and the marriage eventually came to an end, many expected distance or even bitterness to completely erase any connection. But reality turned out to be more complex than that. After the divorce, Winnie did not step away from public life. Instead, Winnie remained active in Parliament and continued to speak on issues affecting ordinary people until passing in 2018. That raises another thought. What kind of strength keeps someone in the public eye after so much controversy and pressure? Life after the marriage came with both influence and challenges. In 2003, legal trouble emerged in the form of fraud and theft convictions connected to bank loans that were meant to help economically disadvantaged individuals. Supporters often argued that the intention behind such involvement came from a desire to assist struggling communities, while critics focused on the legal outcome itself. That contrast created yet another layer to Winnie's public image, one that mixed admiration with criticism, strength with controversy. Even with that complexity, Winnie continued to stand alongside powerful movements that pushed for change. Support for the economic freedom fighters showed alignment with more radical political ideas, while support for the Treatment Action Campaign reflected commitment to social justice, especially in the fight against HIV and AIDS policies. That combination revealed something important, because it showed that activism did not follow a single straight line. It moved across different struggles, from politics to health, from economic justice to national identity. And then another question naturally appeared. Was Winnie misunderstood? Or was Winnie simply unwilling to soften beliefs for public approval? At the same time, Nelson followed a path that seemed almost opposite in tone. A strong focus on reconciliation, forgiveness, and unity became the defining message after release from prison and during leadership of South Africa. That approach aimed to bring former enemies into one shared future, rather than divide the nation further. But not everyone agreed with that vision. Winnie stood firm in rejecting the idea of forgiving those responsible for apartheid's pain without deeper accountability. That difference created a powerful contrast, almost like two sides of the same struggle standing side by side, but never fully merging. Nelson represented healing and rebuilding, while Winnie represented resistance and memory. One voice asked for peace, while the other refused to let pain be forgotten too quickly. Even after separation, there was no complete rejection between both figures. Reports suggested that Nelson once described life after the split as deeply lonely, which revealed a quiet emotional truth behind the public image. That detail made everything feel more human, because it showed that beyond politics and history, there was still a personal connection that never fully disappeared. Another question then comes up: can two people walk completely different paths and still remain connected in some deeper way? In this case, the answer seemed to be yes. There was distance, but not complete separation. There was disagreement, but not total rejection. When thinking about legacy, Winnie often made it clear that identity could not be reduced to marriage alone. Being known as the mother of the nation and the conscience of a nation carried meaning far beyond any relationship. That identity spoke to years of activism, sacrifice, and presence during some of the most difficult times in South African history. And again, a quiet question sits in the background. How does one person carry both admiration and controversy at the same time and still remain unforgettable? The answer seemed to rest in impact. Whether praised or criticized, Winnie remained impossible to ignore. The relationship between Nelson and Winnie shaped more than personal lives. That union reflected a nation's struggle with identity, justice, and the future. One path leaned toward peace and unity, while another refused to let go of anger and demanded stronger action. Both paths carried truth in different ways, and both paths left a mark on history. In the end, maybe the real question is not about who was right or wrong, but about what South Africa needed at different moments in time. Was reconciliation enough without accountability? Could resistance exist without risking further division? These questions continue to echo, long after both voices have faded, leaving behind a story that feels less like a simple relationship and more like a powerful reflection of a country finding its way forward. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.